hold on to your hats. The countdown to the biggest wellness event of the year is on.
Join us on August 15 and 16 in Melbourne for not 1 but 2 days of Powerhouse Wellness, featuring 11 of Australia's most inspiring, entertaining, educating, fermentating speakers.
Damo, what is fermentating?
MP, I'll tell you at the summit.
Your favourite wellness couch speakers are joined by special guest Nat Kringoudis on all things hormones and female health.
Join the Up for a Chat girls, the wellness guys, the natural nutritionist Steph Lowe, Cale Brock, Quirky Cookings, Joe Witt, Marcus Pearce, and the rest of your favourite wellness couch podcasters.
Regular and VIP tickets are still available, but hurry before this summit is sold out. For tickets, go to www.thewellnesssummit.com. The Wellness Summit is proudly brought to you by Well and You. Be someone that makes you happy.
TheWellnessCouch.com, streaming wellness into your lives.
Welcome to Nourishing the Mother, featuring your hosts Bridget Wood and Julie Tenner.
Hello and welcome to Nourishing the Mother. I'm Bridget Wood.
I'm Julie Tenner.
And today we're interviewing an expert, Elle Griffin. So before we get started into that, we're going to tell you a little bit about the retreat that we've got coming up that we're finally ready to tell the world about, our Nourishing the Mother retreat on the 8th of November. Over to you, Julie.
We've really been able to pull together this fantastic day that I'm incredibly excited about, that nourishes a woman's soul in so many areas. We really want women to walk out of that reconnecting with the joy and their bliss in their lives, delving into some pretty deep stuff, and certainly awakening their soul, connecting to their divine feminine, and really getting back in love with their lives and their mothering experience. So we've got both Bridget and I doing areas of that, as well as some guest speakers in that. So it's looking like an absolutely divinely amazing experience. And if you would really like to be part of that, reinvigorate your mothering journey and reconnect to your divine feminine, then please jump on our Facebook page and connect in, which is at Nourishing the Mother on Facebook. Yeah. So today we're interviewing Elle, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of Over the Moon magazine and also the host of Over the Moon Radio. She's an entrepreneur, is currently doing her master's on the Virgin Mary, and is herself a woman on a divine feminine journey. So Elle, welcome, and thank you for being part of Nourishing the Mother.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
So we're very excited to have you here.
Yes.
And hand over to Bridget, who's going to kick us off.
So today we really wanted to chat to you about the most historical feminine archetypes, which for our Western culture happen to become from the Bible. But really, could you just tell us a little bit about how you've got to where you are on your journey and I guess your explorations of Mariology and because I really think that there's so much that's not told in our current experience of the Bible story. You know, growing up, you very much fed the kind of the masculine view of Jesus and all of that. And I myself, schooled Catholic for 12 years and never really looked critically at that. And so I'm just kind of like opening the Pandora's box of this other way of seeing those stories and those powerful feminine figures. Mm.
Yeah, so kind of what got me into all of this was that very thing, right? So I was looking for a role model in my spiritual life, and I wanted to develop myself more in a spiritual sense. And the Bible is written by men. Every single book of the Bible is written by a man, and that's not a bad thing at all. But there is some context that you have to take into consideration when you're reading the Bible, because you might notice that a lot of times the male characters in the Bible, they're given names, they have these roles, and then the women characters, a lot of times they're not even named. You just kind of hear like an aside mention of them. And so it's easy when you're reading the Bible to say, this is what it looks like to be a spiritual person. But what you're really looking at is what it's like to be a spiritual person as a man. Mm. So for me, I found it difficult to relate to, say, the Apostle Peter or the Apostle Paul, because they're coming at God from a very different relationship. I mean, if you can imagine Jesus being alive today and you're hanging out with him with a group of friends, a relationship that a guy would have with Jesus would be very different than a relationship that a girl would have with Jesus. Yes. I think that's just, the way that we are. And you can even see that in the Bible, the men, they're always doing stuff in the Bible. They're always like, okay, so what you're saying is you want me to do this, and they go out and have this big action plan. They write these books of the Bible. They're going out and asking him to heal their sons. They're going out and preaching in his name. They're going out, like, right before, when they got to Jerusalem, all the disciples go and they get them a donkey and they go find a place for them to stay. And they're very, logical, rational, action-oriented guys. The women in the Bible, meanwhile, you see like a story of like Martha and Mary, where there's this woman just like sitting at Jesus's feet listening to him tell stories. And this is a particularly interesting, little story, because in it, Martha is the sister, and she's like cleaning the dishes and she's setting the table and she's doing all this stuff for Jesus. And he's like, stop that. Your sister Mary has it right, who's just sitting here listening to me tell stories. Mm-hmm. So that's a very different relationship what Mary has with Jesus in that story. Is she's just sitting at his feet. She's just listening, soaking it all in. It's not very action oriented. It's very receptive. So I started just kind of studying these women in the Bible, because they're totally there, but they're just like a quieter force. We don't hear about them as much. They're almost sort of hidden, just because they didn't write the stories themselves. So they're, being told about them. Mm. And over and over and over again, we see that. We see that in, Claudia, Pontius Pilate's wife, who says, don't kill this man, Jesus. I had a dream about him last night, and I think he's the Messiah. That's just a one sentence thing in the Bible that you hear, and you hear this whole long drawn out story about Pontius Pilate trying to decide whether or not he wants to crucify Jesus, and how he chooses this robber in his place, and all this stuff that seems very, action oriented. And here you have his wife saying, you can't do this because I had a dream about it. So there's all these just like stories of these women in the Bible, and they have a very different relationship with God, with the divine, where they are, they're listening to Jesus. They're having dreams about Jesus. They're, Miriam in the Old Testament is dancing around the fire with tambourines, and that's how she prays to God. So there's this very unique, more intimate, more loving, nurturing relationship that the women have with God. And so I really wanted to study that so that I could learn how I could be in a relationship with God that was very feminine, very unique to us. So who better to study than, the Virgin Mary? She's the ultimate. And in fact, for me, working with the Virgin Mary was an amazing thing, because a lot of what we get today, she's the most prominent female figure in the Bible, apart from, Eve. And she is where we get a lot of our stories about our sexuality, about purity, or about good and bad. A lot of that comes from Mary, whether you're religious or not, just because our society was religious for so long. And that made up a lot of early civilization, was those stories about Mary.
That's really true.
So this is where the archetypes start coming in, because you're like, okay, if I have, as a woman, for example, I was, one of those girls that in high school, I was like, I'm saving myself for marriage, sex is a sin, all this stuff. When you start to tell yourself those stories, it helps to, that can be a little bit damaging on your system. If you're, starting to feel like there's like this, it's very common in Christianity to have this kind of like sinner syndrome, where you're just like constantly feel like there's nothing you can do right, and you feel like everything about yourself is wrong, your sexuality is wrong, your thoughts are impure, all this stuff. So it helps when you're trying to heal these things to look at the archetypes. So to find those stories of the people that did it right, or that you feel did it right, and to learn from them.
That's really exactly where we wanted to go, Elle, which is perfect that you've hit it off there, because the three women that we really wanted you, with your expertise, to cover today was the archetype of the Virgin Mary, being that virginal, asexual archetype that so many women are compared to. And then obviously what I feel like is her direct opposite is Mary Magdalene being the very sexual, demonized version of the feminine, and then Eve being the creator of sin and of pain in womankind and all of this sort of concepts. They're actually the three we did want to really discuss with you today. So I love that you've opened that up and started with that as well. And I love that you touched on the Virgin Mary being this representation that, particularly for young girls going through puberty, can cause a lot of conflict about who they are and who their feminine is, and what's okay for them to move into and out of.
Yes, definitely.
So when we talk about the Virgin Mary as the archetype, I love that you were so open about your story of, which I know is so common for so many of the girls I grew up with if I looking at this particular way of this, high buttoned kind of very virginal person, then I'm pure and worthy. And if I slip out of that, then there's a sense of unworthiness, and it sort of feels like a very tricky, slippery slope to fit in. Is there more that you could expand on with that, and I suppose what the scope is of the Virgin Mary as you see her and know her?
Yes. So I think a lot of that comes from, there's a lot to the Mary story, and I think healing this kind of story of what Mary's story really is, just like healing our story around what Mary Magdalene really is, and who those people are, I think is very healing, and it was very healing to my story, because if you think about the Virgin Mary, what you're going to think about is this woman with like this blue cloth covering her head and this like drapey gown, and she's got a halo around her, and she's holding a baby, and she's looking into his face, and she just seems very not real. She seems like an angel, or like a just like this kind of goddess or god, like kind of in an archetypal way that she is unapproachable. She doesn't seem like a real woman. She seems like kind of like a fantasy.
Yes.
Because over time, every culture has made her out to be whatever they viewed as divine. So the very first images of Mary came about in Europe, where to them royalty was considered, the closest thing to God, to the divine. So they made her look like a Byzantine queen with the robes and the halos and all the crown and all that stuff. And meanwhile, when Catholicism came to South America, she became what they really revered was Mother Earth. So in their artwork, she looks like this like Earth Mother with like stars all over her, and like mountain. Her dress looks like a mountain, and people are walking all over her. And so whatever culture it was, put her up on a pedestal, whatever their pedestal looked like. And that's kind of what was passed down to us over and over again. What helps, I think, is to go back to the historical story of Mary as much as we can. And that's why I wanted to start studying her, because when you really look at who she was, like what really happened here, she was a 13-year-old girl, Middle Eastern girl, living in the town of Galilee. Like, she was a villager. She probably had a little bit of money because there were mention of what, animals she brought to sacrifice and stuff, which showed that she was a little bit well off. And she was not married, and she was pregnant.
I did not know she was 13.
It's interesting here because, so in the New Testament, in the Bible, the word that we use, virgin, it actually means unwed. It didn't used to have anything to do with sexuality. That was added in later.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that either.
Wow.
Yeah, so it comes from the Greek, the Parthenos. So I'm going to mess that word up. I don't speak Greek. But she, it meant unwed, unmarried. And that's also the word that's used in the Old Testament when there were prophecies like showing that she was going to come, that the Messiah was going to be born to this unmarried woman.
God, that in itself puts a whole different spin on it, doesn't it? Just changing what that word virgin means.
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally. And you also have to understand that at that time there was not enough scientific evidence as to how a child was produced. So they didn't know that sperm meets an egg and that's how a baby is born. that was like, they didn't know about eggs in a woman's womb or anything like that. It wouldn't have even been able to be seen at the time. Obviously, they knew what happened to a man because everything's external. They could see, there's evidence. So they figured that the man essentially created the body, and the body just went into the woman's womb. So like basically the man created the child by himself. It kind of went into the woman's womb, and then God animated the spirit and made it into a person, into a human being. So there's like...
Oh, that is fascinating. I'm having all these epiphany moments as I connect some dots. Oh my goodness, that's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, so basically the woman's just an oven and totally the guy's bun.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, and I think too, it's really interesting to look at it that way, because I think we often just think, oh, they just projected this whole idea that men are everything. But in fact, in the absence of them having any concept of how that biologically works, and if the masculine's always been held up as, we are the kind of the rulers as such, and that women are our servants, which is really, I suppose, the era in which Mary lived, then that would be an obvious connection for them to make, that as if the woman has anything to do with this, they are really just, they're only one level up from animals kind of scenario.
And that God places the spirit in there. I really love that whole concept that you've just highlighted. I really do.
Yeah, and I think that was, it wasn't a very far stretch for them to say that Jesus was the Son of God, that there was no father figure, that God was the father figure, and it was God's child in Mary's womb, because the way that they viewed it at the time was God animated the spirit in the womb, because, and every child was named for that. I mean, if you look at the naming conventions back then, in the Aramaic, every child's name would be translated as God's child, God's son of God. Like there was all different forms of from God, of God, God's chosen, God's son, everything was in the name, built into the name, because they knew that it took, 3 people to make a child, a guy's sperm, a woman's just womb, and God to animate the spirit. So the absence of the man wasn't that big of a deal to them. Or wouldn't have been seen as big of a deal.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, so when you start to think about it like that, you already start to get this picture of this person who's a little bit more relatable. And you're like, okay, maybe this isn't such a crazy scene that, think about that. If you're going to, 2nd or 3rd century, you start talking about, Mary, she's a virgin, she's never had sex, and then we start to learn what that means scientifically to never have sex, so it's not even possible, and all this stuff that we learn later, then of course we get further and further removed from her, and we start to say, okay, this woman who's never had sex and she's the ideal of purity, then there's nothing we can do. There's no possible way we can live up to that unless we're like a nun, and surely God doesn't want us all to be nuns. So it becomes so unrelatable that us trying to take on the Mary image of this virginal, pure, chaste, bride-looking figure, we can't live up to that. So of course we're going to feel less than and unworthy. But when we start to see her as this person, that's just this 13-year-old girl that's just pregnant, she believes in miracles, she believes God animates the spirit, brings people into the world for a reason, and she's just feeling so grateful to have this child and to be taken care of by a man, because then it would be presumably so. We don't know very much about Joseph, but, according to I think that the best thing that we can learn about Joseph is based on the almost anthropology of the time, so knowing more about that culture at the time. So if you could imagine, during this time period, population was a struggle. Like now we have so many people we can't even think about this, but at the time, if you're living in this tiny, small desert community of Galilee, and if you have 1 man and 5 women, you have the potential to have 5 children being born at the same time, right?
Yeah.
If you have 1 woman and 5 men, you have the possibility of 1 child being born at the same time. So in an era when infant mortality was extremely high, so, most children were, if they didn't die as an infant, they died under the age of 5. And women half the time died in childbirth. Then what you're dealing with is constantly, you need men to work the field, to fish the seas, to keep your community afloat. If you don't have more children and tons of them in case, there's sickness and things that befall the kids that they don't make it to the age of 5, then your community is not even going to survive. So what would often happen is, the man would take either multiple wives, or, he would have 1 wife, and if she couldn't bear enough children, she would let him sleep with, her handmaiden, her maids. They had to have multiple ways of bringing more kids into the world. And so oftentimes the Joseph figure, we don't know for certain, but a lot of people will say, okay, so she was with child, so they found out she was with child, and they gave her to Joseph, as he was one of the men in the town overlooking all these women that were having children. And it was very important at the time for a woman, if she was going to have a child, to be partnered with a man, because otherwise she would most likely die, and her child would most likely die, because she doesn't have monetary support, she doesn't have any land, she doesn't have any rights. If she's seen pregnant and doesn't have a husband, she'll be stoned to death as per the law. So he was more like this protective figure, and I kind of relate to that. So once you see this picture of okay, this desert community, this young bride, this man, this child, it starts to seem more relatable, and you can say, and to me, I think that that's very healing, because you can look at that and be like, oh, maybe she is just like me after all. Maybe it's not this so far removed. Maybe my holiness isn't dependent on an unrealistic image, but rather a very realistic image. So that's what I really like about it.
So do you still see, given the word virgin has different context in that era, do you still see her as virginal in our modern day concept?
I'm not really sure, actually. I've thought about that a lot, and tradition, I do put a lot behind tradition, because I think that traditionally she was seen as not having had sex. But what I was thinking about when I was thinking about this recently was that it doesn't change the story for me either way. And so I got to a place where I was like, you know what? I don't need to get to the bottom of Mary's sex life. Nobody needs to get to the bottom of my sex life, and I don't need to get to the bottom of hers, because it doesn't change the story to me at all. I still believe that Jesus was the Son of God either way. And I think what was more important about the whole story, about the Virgin Mary's story, was what was behind that concept. So when they're saying virgin, when they're saying unwed, whether they're saying with or without sex, the point they're trying to get across here is she belonged to no man. She was nobody's property.
Oh, that is fascinating.
Wow, yeah.
She only belonged to herself. And that's what I think really powerful.
Oh, Elle, I love that. So in terms of the Virgin Mary archetype, you've really given us this fantastic historical reshaping of how to view her as a woman that we can connect with, as opposed to a pedestal that's unattainable. How do you, what do you really see as an archetype for the modern day woman of the Virgin Mary, what you would like to see belief systems shift so that they can, I suppose what I'm saying is, what are the negative viewpoints that we see the Virgin Mary with, and how that influences modern day women's lives, and really what is the way that we can shift that to aspire to take in part of the archetype that is her, the positive side?
Yeah, so I think the negative side is kind of what's obvious, this sexual, anti-sexual being. If you think about, a lot of times if you think about the Virgin Mary being lived out today, you would think about a nun. You would think the most spiritual person on this world is a nun, because she's the most like the Virgin Mary. And we might not even think about this consciously, but it's just handed down to us over time and time and time and time again. Like, those are the messages that we start to receive. And even in the church, I have had, priests say I'm not allowed to speak in their church because they read my writing and they're like, you're clearly not Catholic or even Christian because I'm saying some of the things that I'm saying to you now. And I think that that's exactly it, right? Like that in itself is ostracizing. If I was a teenager and was having somebody say, you're not Christian because you have sex before marriage, or did you ever read the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye?
No.
Never
Oh my gosh, it was such a thing in the Christian world when I was in high school, and it was about this guy who decided to never even do so much as kiss his wife until their wedding day. So they didn't even kiss until their wedding day, and his thinking was that if you even so much as look at a woman and feel like you want to have her body sexually, then you're committing sin, you're committing adultery. And if you even, if you touch each other and it brings sexual thoughts to mind, then that's a sin. And so he didn't even want to be a part of that at all. So he was like, let me get the furthest apart we can. Me and this girl that I met, we're just going to do nothing more than hold hands. And even then he talks about his struggle, because he's like, we were holding hands and I felt like I wanted to have sex with her. And so I stopped holding her hand. Oh, and I read this as now I'm appalled by this, but as a teenager, and I read this and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so impure. I have sexual thoughts all the time. Me and my little high school boyfriend are making out late at night
that
by my car,
such conflict.
I'm thinking about how I want to have sex with him, even though we're not going to. And I'm this horrible sinner. Yeah. And that just screws you up. I know from my own standpoint, after, even when my husband and I started having sex, I would feel not consciously sinful, but I would feel there was something wrong with me or something. That's it creates this weird environment where you have to avoid wanting and thinking about sex for most of your life. And then you just have to flip a switch and suddenly you have to want sex. And now it's okay, which is really, really weird of having this, this kind of sexuality is bad, this kind of sexuality is good. And
which is really hard for the woman, isn't it? Because I know in your blog and, in your magazine and in your radio, you talk so much about sensuality as being a really big part of the divine feminine. And so what you're saying is there's such a disconnect and conflict, internal conflict, for grown women, but also for women that have grown up. Well, we've all kind of grown up with that, whether you're Catholic or not. We've grown up with that internal message in a way, haven't we? That this is bad, but then this is okay. And how do you reconcile those in a really sensual, womanly space, isn't it? How do you reconnect?
And I guess perhaps it almost evolved. I certainly know from my own, being a teenager, it evolved to a point where, you could still, the man could feel pleasure, or and your sole purpose, all the girls' magazines would talk about, how to give a good blowjob, or it'd be always about pleasuring the man, because we almost weren't worthy to connect with our body or of pleasure, and so we almost had that disconnection with ourselves and that sense of dirtiness if we were to desire that or explore that ourselves.
Yes.
So how have you then reconnected that process for you, Elle? Because I know what you're essentially saying here is, here's the archetype I grew up with, and here's the conflict that it created within me as a young woman moving through life and love. How have you managed to go through that and therefore bring in different concepts of that archetype to heal that and reconnect with your divine feminine?
Yeah, so I think that what was really important to me was essentially two aspects of Mary, and that was that regardless of her story, what it really was with sexuality, the importance of her story in the Bible and what they were really, I think that we tear apart her story and we try to create all these okay, Virgin Mary, okay, that means no sex, okay, that means that sex is bad, so that means sex before marriage is bad, and they're kind of just rolled away with that, with all these tangents on her, which I think were just kind of unnecessary. When in reality, to me, when I'm reading this, what these authors are trying to get across about her is two things. One, that she belonged fully to herself. And two, that she had God in her body. So the archetype of her being pregnant with God is huge. That is what they were trying to get across the most, more than anything else. Even describing her as a virgin, whatever they're using to tell her story, it's why that's important is because when they're telling the story, they're saying she was pregnant with God. Like God was in her womb. And what I think is so potent about that is it's a physical representation that we can relate to. Like we're told in the Bible countless times over and over and over again, God is in you, God is in you, God is with you all the time, every step of the way and every hair of your body. But we don't really get to like understand what that means to me until we see Mary pregnant with God. Because now we have this image that's like, oh, like God is literally inside me. Like not just like spiritually, not just like in my soul, but like in my physical body as a woman. Like God is in my pinky to such an extent, like more than anything else. Like my body is made of God.
Yeah, I really get that. So maybe next we'll have a look at Mary Magdalene, who obviously, well, my view of her is that she represents very much the sexual archetype, and with that comes a very negative connotation to the sexual woman and certainly references her as a prostitute. Are you able to sort of pull her story apart a little bit for us?
Yes, so Mary's a funny one because there's been so much with her in pop culture recently, you know, like the Da Vinci Code and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene being found and all this stuff. She's just kind of been everywhere. And I think that it's been really interesting, especially seeing her as this like sexual archetype, because there's really not a lot of founding behind that. Because for one, we've long believed that she is, you know, the reason why they associate her with the prostitute is there's this unnamed prostitute in the Bible. And later on they were like, oh, that must have been Mary Magdalene. But there's really no connotation there. Like there's nothing that ever says that Mary Magdalene's a prostitute. Mary Magdalene's story as told in the Bible, the only time that she's like named, you know, the first time she's named is in relation to demons. You know, she's full of demons, her body's full of demons, and Jesus gets rid of them. They leave her body. Now, what those demons are, we don't know, because there's so much back then that would have been considered demons. I mean, you could have like a strep throat and somebody would be like, you have a demon in your throat. That's probably an exaggeration, but basically the things that they couldn't understand or know that caused a negative impact on your body were often associated with demons. You know, that's why people like say bless you when you sneeze, because they were trying to keep evil spirits from entering your body. So it was like there's no real founding behind that as Mary as this like sexual woman. We don't know if she was sexual or not from the Bible. Yeah, of course, later on, there was this Gnostic text that was found called the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And everybody makes a really big deal about that one because it says that Jesus kissed her on the mouth. It was a phrase used in that gospel. But the thing about that is it's a Gnostic text. And so Gnostic texts are, it would be like you or me, we sit down and we're like meditating or praying, and so I'll just speak from my own personal experience. So I often think about Jesus as like my boyfriend or something, because that's how I understand love best on earth, because I have a really great relationship with my husband and he's, you know, the most loving person I ever know. So if I'm in prayer and I imagine that Jesus is next to me and I have my head on his shoulder and I'm just relaxing, and I'm just thinking, oh, I love you. This is so amazing. And maybe he kisses me on the head, and this is all just me being in prayer and meditation. So now imagine that I write down that experience. So I type out, so then Jesus kissed me on the head. Am I saying that Jesus literally kissed me? No, I'm saying it was just my own prayer or meditation, or what back then they would have called a vision that I had. Mm-hmm. And that's what Gnostic texts were. So Gnosticism was a branch of Christianity that was viewed more mystic. That's what they would do. They would go into meditation. They would have these trances or visions, and then they would write those down, and they would write it in the name of whatever apostle. So you might have seen there's also a Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. There's one written in the style of John. So it would be like, and so one was written in the style of Mary Magdalene. And the reason for that is it was probably a woman who was writing this experience. And so much like me writing about my experience with Jesus in my prayer, she would have done the same thing. And she writes and she titles it The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, because to her, this felt like a revelation that was very almost like she was Mary Magdalene in this instance, where she had that intimate relationship. Mary Magdalene was the first to see the risen Jesus. She obviously had a close connection with Jesus. And so she might have even felt like in her vision she was the Mary Magdalene, and so she wrote the story like that. So that was what was traditionally common with the Gnostic Gospels. So it is interesting that Mary Magdalene today takes on the archetype of this seductress, because to me, we don't even know if she was a seductress or not. The foundings for that statement aren't very founded.
Yeah,
to me anyway.
No, I'd actually heard recently one of my friends had said that she'd seen a documentary on Mary Magdalene, and that in that documentary is a historical documentary that they had pulled apart that story. And they were putting forward the view that perhaps there was a bit of jealousy between her and the men that were around at the time. And she was actually a woman of means, so she was probably a widow or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that she was almost like the manager of Jesus. So she was the woman who went ahead to the next village and organised the place where he would speak and all of these sorts of things. And so we're seen with him in a managerial role. And so they had quite an intimate, almost level relationship. Have you heard that at all?
That's funny. That totally could be. I think one of the things that they're getting at with that is that she clearly was hanging out with all the disciples. She was one of them. She was hanging out in their gang all the time. Did she manage the finances? Did she go out before him? We don't know, because they don't talk about that ever. But we do find her name popping up all over the place as if she was just in their band or group. And, there may have been tons of women in that disciple group, but we just wouldn't hear about them because it was just the tradition of the time. You write down and document the men's names, but you don't need to write down and document the women's names. So it does give her prominence and importance that her name is even mentioned. What she was doing with them or what her role was, I don't know, but she was clearly close to him.
So at what point do you feel that she became associated with the prostitute archetype? Do you know roughly when that happened and what was happening culturally at that time?
I don't know when that happened. I'm not exactly sure. There's always something that it always starts with some person just making the connection, and then everybody just kind of follows it for a few years until someone's like, wait, why did you decide that? Yeah. So I don't know when that started or when that stopped, because I haven't read up on it, unfortunately.
No, that's okay. Do you see the biblical versions of Mary Magdalene and the Virgin Mary as deliberate archetypes, as referencing historical women of the era, or as tainted stories through the eyes of the male storytellers around at the time?
I think both. There's definitely truth to them, and I took a really interesting course in school that was called Mary and Women in Ancient Israel, and what it did was deconstruct why a man would write a female role as he did, and I thought it was really interesting because there's when you learn the context, or like why somebody was writing the story, what point were they trying to make, you can understand the female roles better. So, for example, in the story of Jezebel in the Old Testament, we have this woman who is betrayed, or who is portrayed as sort of the downfall of Israel, because she came from this polytheist community. She had multiple gods, and she married into one of the tribes of Israel, and she was their downfall because she made her king believe in all these like multiple gods or whatever. And so they portrayed her as a harlot, that she slept around, that she was a prostitute, that she, that was, and for years, that's what she was. She was this prostitute. She was this evil person that just turned an entire nation bad, like turned her to her evil ways. But what you have to look at is like, okay, but what is the storyteller trying to say here? Why are they pinning it all on Jezebel? Why give her the name harlot when there's nothing that shows any kind of sexual connotation there at all? And the answer is, to them, she was cheating on God. So they were a monotheist, mostly monotheist community, believed in this one God, or at least this one God was the right God, and that all the other gods were bad gods. So if she's believing in all these other gods and worshiping them, then she's a harlot. She's cheating on her, prostituting her God.
That's really interesting. Looking at it.
And so that was kind of the image they were trying to set out. Like, if you believe in multiple gods, then you're not believing in you're not worshiping the one true God. So it's not necessarily who Jezebel was as a person. She wasn't necessarily a harlot. She wasn't necessarily a prostitute, but it was trying to show that, trying to get a point across, trying to make the monotheist case.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It seems to me a bit of a theme that what we view now, the words we're using currently, modern day, that are sexual, actually have a completely different meaning when we're looking at the historical reference.
Yeah.
Which then completely shifts the way that you view that story.
I think it all just has this thread of really bringing some critical thinking around the stories that we're told, and to understand the context in which they were told, and the times in which they happened. It's really so interesting to look at our perceptions of things, and then look at, okay, how was it really in terms of what we actually know, as opposed to those stories. Yes, that's so interesting. It's funny you mentioned. Sorry. You go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's kind of like, it's like if you go out on a date with a guy and you have this whole date, and I don't know about you, but I have a lot of single friends that are dating, and they always come back and like tell the story of this date in like excruciating detail. You're like, and you're hinging on every word. You're like, oh my gosh, he did not say that. He did that. Oh my gosh. You come up, they have this whole story of how the date went. So if you imagine one of your girlfriends telling you the story of how her date went, you picture the guy a certain way. Well, imagine that you were the guy's side. The guy goes home to his guy friends and tells them all the story of his date. You would get two totally different pictures of what that date was actually like.
Yeah, it's true.
There's the girl's version and the guy's version. Like, my husband and we've even had this happen to us once, where like the girl comes and tells me the story, and the guy comes and tells my husband Garrett the story, and then we compare notes and later, and we're like, oh, I viewed him totally different than he actually was.
That's just fascinating, because it also illustrates the power in terms of what to be a woman looks like for us. If those stories of womanhood are told through men, which is what has happened throughout history. You mentioned earlier the Da Vinci Code, and I in preparation for this, I thought I must go back and have a look at that book, because that caused such a stir sort of 12 years ago when that came out, and it was really denounced by the Catholic Church because it suggested that it was all really about honouring and worshipping the feminine, and that had basically been written out of history. What's your view on that whole thing?
I love that book. And I think that, again, the point that's being made there is just that there's this different relationship that women have with God, and it is more intimate than, you know, we don't need to get down on our knees and pray like all day long, or sit under a tree under meditation like for 10 hours. Like, we don't have to be the same person that we see the disciples being in their relationship to God, that's very rational and functional and making decisions and splitting the money and being the treasury and all this stuff. But when it's coming back to the feminine understanding of, we're the ones sitting at the feet, we're listening to the story, we're the ones, you know, wiping the tears of Jesus off his feet with our hair, we're putting oils on his skin, you know, we're the women having dreams about him, and that book kind of brought that to light. It's like, hey, like, there's this intimate quality that women have with God. And I think it just made us remember that, you know, it was a fun story. And I love that he pulls from so much like real wisdom and truth, but it is a fictional story, but you know, the truth to it to me was that it awoke that feminine archetype in us that made us remember, oh, I can be like a woman in my relationship with God. I don't have to be like a man.
It is really bringing back that central side of femininity into religion again, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So I really wanted to just, the last person we really wanted to talk about was Eve, obviously being such a profound feminine archetype, I'm going to say, for so many women. So my kids go to Catholic school, and so that's one of the first stories they ever hear about. And that beyond that, I'm also a doula, so I work with women giving birth. And so these themes of Eve keep coming up for me. So I just wondered if you could pull apart a little bit the archetype of Eve and the creation of sin, and how you sort of place her in your world.
Yeah, so I think it's important to note when we're talking about Eve that Mary was set up to be the new Eve. So there's these two prominent women, the Eve in the Old Testament and Mary in the New Testament, where all of creation comes from Eve, and then the Christ, the Savior, comes from Mary. And sort of what this represents is Eve is this creator of life, but soon after, we have this beautiful paradise, and we're living in the trees, and we're just naked and eating everything, and it's amazing, and we're just having sex all day outside in the leaves, and it's just like this beautiful like oasis, and all the trees just like leaning in to give us food, and it's amazing, like just total paradise on earth. And then what happens is, and kind of the way that there's so many, by the way, there's so many ways that you can take a lot of the things I'm saying. I'm just sharing the kind of ones that make most sense to me.
Yes.
But one of the arguments that I really love about the Eve story is that there's some negative connotation there. She caused Adam to sin. She ate the apple. She wasn't supposed to eat the apple. God told her not to. What does this all mean? To me, what it means is the disconnection, the disassociation of the feminine from the masculine, where before they're equal. You know, what it says in the Old Testament in Genesis, it says, and God created them in his image, in his own image, he created them man and female. And to me, that says the image of God is male and female. Mm-hmm. And so he created two parts of himself on earth, the male side and the female side, Adam and Eve. And what happened was those two were supposed to be like connected, like, you know, those two connected, you know, if you want to look at it super literally, having sex, the union of the male and the female is God. That's God complete. Mm. If you're going to say we were created in God's image, male and female, we were created, then when we're together, then that's God full, complete. Mm. When we're apart, we're just the female side and just the male side. And what happens with this apple is we see this apple, and what it is, you know, God saying, here's this apple, you know, this is the only one that you shouldn't eat, you know, just this one, because there's evil in the world, there's bad stuff in the world, and this is the tree of knowledge, and I created you as humans in this paradise so you don't have to see all this crazy spiritual warfare that's going outside of you, outside of this world I created for you. But now Eve has the chance to, instead of doing something selfless, something that involves the two of them working together, she acts of her own volition, and she does something solely for her own benefit, and that's that she wants to become wise, and she wants to know the things that God knows. And so she eats it, and then she gives an apple to Adam, and he does the same thing. He's like, I want some knowledge, like, screw all this, like you and me just having this perfect connection and bond. Let's do this. And so they ate the apple. And then what happens? The punishment, we can think about it literally, that the guy has to work every day and toil the soil. The girl has to have painful childbirth. But what he's saying here is, now your perfect connection, your perfect union is now separate. Now you are just the male half of God and the female half of God. And the woman, you're going to do the childbirth and all that stuff. And the man, he's going to work and create everything for you. And he's going to be rule over your household. And so for me, we see the punishment being separation of the male and the female. Mm-hmm. And so for generation and generation thereafter, the whole Old Testament, we see this playing out as the male being the bigger, the patriarchal society, the male having all the rights, being able to own property, the woman having no rights and needing a man to support her and having a child, all this stuff until Mary, a woman who belongs to no man, gives birth to God.
Oh my gosh, you brought that full circle. I love it.
Wow, that's amazing.
So it's like this big dividend, and to me, that's what Mary was here to heal, to bring back the feminine and masculine back together to create God again.
Oh my gosh, I love Mary now.
Yeah. And that's interesting too, because, you say that God created men and women, the masculine and feminine, as of himself, and yet I'm not sure if it's still this way, but, you go back and you look at the Old Testament, and it's that God created Eve from Adam's rib. And so was that again, that's representation of creating a woman from a man as a result of the times that followed, which said that, the kind of only the men could own property, all of those things. It's almost been distorted in another way.
Yeah, and there's two creation stories in Genesis. So if you read that, the first book of the Bible, that's what you'll see. You'll see one version of creation where he creates the male and female in his image, and then a short chapter later, you'll see the version where Eve is pulled from his rib. So there's both stories there, and the reason for that could be many things, but it could also be because now we have this separation of the male and the female.
Wow. Oh my gosh, Elle, I just love that. I'd love so much hearing your wisdom on all things feminine archetype. It was really completely gorgeous. Is there anything you would like to leave the mothers of this world that we're connecting with your knowledge? Is there anything that you would really like them to know at this point, or anything you'd like to say?
I think just if there's any moment that we can spare to just remember that we too are full of God, and we too can help bring humanity back to this image that Mary was trying to bring us back to, that male and female are together and so great, and that there's not a hierarchy. It's not male is better than the female or the female is better than the male, but that we are all together make up what God is, and that we can recreate that heaven on earth, that we can do that right here by just being with each other and recognizing that we are all full of God, that we are pregnant with God, we are full of God in every ounce of our being and in our bodies, not just in our souls. And so I think just recognizing that, and then however, if it's an archetype that helps you or whatever, to just find that. But I just want to thank you guys for having me to tell this stuff, because to me, this is like super geeky. Like, I'm just in my world over here, like learning about Mary for who knows what reason. So it's really cool to get to share why it's important to me with you guys. And I just hope that you guys or your readers or listeners find something in that that's also healing for them and their relationships and their relationship to the divine.
Yeah, thank you. Us too. I really just want to also just give a bit of a rant on your Over the Moon magazine that I completely love the articles in there. Would you like to just quickly tell our listeners how to connect with that and what you're really offering there?
Yes. So Over the Moon magazine is overthemoonmag.com, and it provides spiritual inspiration for the modern woman. And so essentially what it is we have women talking about what it's like to be a woman in relationship to God, in relationship to themselves, to their bodies, from every different faith and tradition. So we have Jewish writers and Catholic writers and spiritual writers and New Age writers and Mormon writers, and we just have everything that you could imagine, all writing about their unique relationship with God and the stories and archetypes that shape them. And also in a way that pairs it with our everyday life, because just as like coming back to the historical Mary can kind of remind us that this isn't like all so far-fetched and we're actually in the same world, when we relate to other women and we are going about our day, like God is just a part of our everyday. It's not just something that exists only on a spiritual magazine. So we try to incorporate a lot of real life and fun and playfulness and women drinking. We always say it's like spirituality that feels more like sipping champagne and less like burning incense, because that would be, the very masculine form of worship. And so we want to have the feminine form of worship here. So we've got women writing about from a very fun and flirty and feminine vibe on God. So it's really fun. It's overthemoonmag.com. And I really like it. So
it's fantastic. It's such a wealth of...
Yes, and your podcasts. Your podcasts are on Over the Moon Radio, which you can connect to through iTunes as well, which we'll put a link up on our Facebook page for as well, which I enjoy. I listen to them every week and I really enjoy it. So thank you so much, Elle, for your time today and catering to my crazy needs of when we needed to fit it in.
Yes,
I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. No, thank you. And look, I have a feeling that in the future we'll probably connect again. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Elle.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Wow, there was just so much in that to totally unpack. I think I'm going to have to come back and listen to this a couple of times. Just totally turned upside down my certainly my experiences growing up Catholic and all those stories. If there's something in that for you that you'd love to share, please connect with us on Facebook /Nourishing the Mother. And I'm going to leave you with this quote from the poet and mystic Rumi, who said that conventional opinion is the ruin of souls. And I really think that this unearthing of the real story of Mary has been a real truth to that point. So thank you.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/The Wellness Couch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives. Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.